Hi everyone. So welcome to this audio lecture where we're going to be exploring how we can apply systems thinking to ecological crisis, particularly when toxic chemicals and hazardous materials contaminate local ecosystems, which have significant health impacts and biological impacts on various life forms, including human beings. So, what inspired this kind of integration between systems thinking and environmental concerns has been the recent reports and news coverage of various industrial accidents that have resulted in hazardous material impacting those environments where the accidents occurred. So in February, many of you may have remembered that East Palestine, or East Palestine, I should say, experienced a train derailment where toxic chemicals entered the environment. And just in the last few weeks, we've also had a trail derailment in Maine. And now there's reports too that contradict the original statement that no contamination occurred. And now we're seeing there has been possible contamination in local water supply from the chemicals and hazardous material on that train. In addition to just a few days ago of this recording, there was two separate plastic plants in two separate states that caught on fire. And again, there was concern of releasing hazardous chemical materials in those environments. And so, what we seem to happen right now is what Senge would call kind of a linear cause and effect, where when we look at the narratives of these industrial accidents, quickly there is this thinking that, okay, this accident happened and we need to clean it up. And once the cleanup begins to commence, I should say, we start to see the news coverage start to focus on some other interesting story that is occurring. And so, with the frequency of these events, it makes us pause and wonder, does that linear thinking really work when we're talking about these ecological disasters? Because, as we know from years of environmental research and studies that have been conducted, chemical contamination of environments, it can take years to understand the full impact of these ecosystems. So, to give some context of what has inspired me on this topic, is even before February of this year, within the state of Maine, there has been an increased emphasis of how toxic chemicals, PFAS, have entered our ecosystem and has had significant impacts on kind of our food systems in the state. So, for example, in 2022, the Maine Department of Wildlife has declared that in certain regions of the state, there was a do not eat order for any animals, in particular deer, hunted in that region due to increase in PFAS levels in their blood. Around the same time, too, we started to see farms within that region, and this is around Fairfield, Maine, report increased levels of PFAS in their soil, and some of these farms have closed down due to the contamination. And at the same time this was happening, the same week that the Maine Department of Wildlife ordered the do not eat order for deer, the state of Maine passed into legislation an amendment to our Constitution essentially stating that we have the right to food. And so, as we can see, we have these rights to have access to food, and part of that language really emphasizes that individuals within the state have the right to harvest, grow, hunt, and even have access to food that provides health and well being. Now, granted, the stipulation that food has to be legally received and cannot infringe on other people's rights or property rights, etc. But really, in taking a step back, what's clear is within the state of Maine, we have a right to access food that is safe and improves our well being. However, how is our right implemented when there is a lot of reports of contaminated ecosystems? In addition to, and just a few months ago, there was a study that released that eating one freshwater fish in the state of Maine would be the equivalent of drinking 30 gallons of contaminated water. And so, as we can see, there's a lot of possible issues with this, and there's concerns that a linear thinking approach may not be helpful in addressing these very complex issues. From a personal perspective, this resonates for me, for I grew up in a town that also had a big issue with environmental contamination, particularly PCBs. So I grew up in Western Massachusetts in it's called a city, but really it's a very small town, or a large town, called Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And the claim to fame for Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in addition to allegedly being the first professional baseball game played in the history of the sport, there's contention to this, but in addition to that, large manufacturing plants, particularly General Electric and General Dynamic, had big industrial facilities in this town, to the point where during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pittsfield, Massachusetts was one of the top 10 places for Cuba and the USSR to nuke due to the large industries in place. And so, what started to occur was industrial chemicals and hazardous materials impacted our natural ecosystem. The Housatonic River was a common dumping ground, and another common waterway dumping ground for industrial waste was known as Silver Lake. So, PCBs is highly still focused in this area. And what's interesting is PCBs were banned in 1979. However, the health effects for PCBs really began to take public consciousness in this town of Pittsfield around the 1990s and 2000s. And I remember growing up, my parents and grandparents and my grandfather, who worked for General Electric, were part of this kind of growing movement in the town of concern about the environmental health effects. And now, about 20 years later, there's still research being conducted of these health effects. And what we see too is there's a growing correlation between cancer and mental health impacts of PCBs. And so, really, growing up in that climate, I remember too, one of the waterways I mentioned was Silver Lake. And Silver Lake was notorious for not freezing during the wintertime. There was always reports of people finding mutilated fish, or excuse me, not mutilated, mutated fish, fish with two heads, multiple eyes, just whatever it may be. Now, again, the mutated fish may be an urban legend, but what is clear is it's well documented that Silver Lake did not freeze during the winter, and that it had sometimes even a glowing hue at night. And there was a pretty pungent smell that occurred. To the point, too, that there was a ban for fishing on Silver Lake. There was a ban for any recreational components. Now, starting in the 2000s, this area began to be cleaned up, and now Silver Lake does freeze in the winter. So anyway, those have been important elements of why I've chosen to focus on this topic. So what's really important to understand is, in using a systems thinking approach, we need to really stop and wonder and give space to this idea: why do these events keep happening? And maybe to confront the linear thinking of, okay, toxic spill occurred, now we're going to clean it up, and now, there's going to be consequences to the organization that caused this issue, and typically it's going to be some compensation package. So maybe rather than viewing that linear type of thinking, we need to step back and understand, okay, how can organizations and institutions learn from these issues? How can we really sit and understand what is occurring and how we can go forward with this? And so, really, one way to do this is kind of through a presencing activity and kind of sitting with this idea of, If we give space to the present moment, what will emerge from it? And for myself, what emerges is the need and the want for these contaminations to be reduced in some level and to have a new increased relationship with that. So, in allowing that emerging want for a future where these contaminations are not a threat, it's maybe helpful then to apply Senge's kind of learning organization model, which, from Senge's view, a learning organization are essentially places where people continually expand their capacity to reflect upon and foster results that they truly desire. So it seems from the public outcry with a lot of these issues, many people truly desire to live in communities that are safe from environmental hazards. And going back to Senge, the part of that learning organization really needs and focuses on expanding the patterns of thinking and nurturing those patterns of thinking that allow us to continually learn and to see the goals that we want become a reality. So, in sticking with Senge, we're going to explore kind of the archetypes that arise that may be playing into the current issues that we're experiencing with these contaminations and possible ways we can implement organizational learning to help mitigate or even cease these issues from occurring in the future. So, what's important to understand with Senge's archetypes, it's these exploring how many of the systems we're in, especially from an organizational level, is impacted by feedback loops. And one of these feedback loops that we commonly see is this growth mindset. And essentially, what starts to happen is there's this belief, especially from an industrial standpoint, where a company or organization is always going to grow. Now, when we're talking about these industrial corporations that produce chemicals or hazardous waste, typically they are taking resources from an environment, manufacturing some capacity, and then selling that product. And so inherently, there is this belief that things are always going to expand. And one can argue that is the kind of the foundation of commercialism and capitalism, that there's always going to be some sort of growth. We just need to find a way to continue to find the resources and convert them to some sort of profit. But as we know of how the natural systems work, there's going to be limitations to growth. When we look at just how nature works, there's going to be times when the population blooms. For example, there's been times in my backyard where we have quite a bit of dragonflies one season, and the next season there's less. Because systems have been in place that allowed those dragons to population to bloom, and also there are control and feedback loops to manage that population. And so, with this in mind, that the byproduct of industrial growth is this kind of contaminated waste that somehow needs to be managed. And so, really, we need to confront this growth mindset that it is flawed in one kind of capacity and also give space to the limitations of these successes. So, for example, going back to the town I was raised in, many of those industries that have contributed to the contamination of the environment have collapsed, have gone out of business, or have moved to other areas because the resources have been completely exploited. And so, again, we need to kind of confront that growth mindset and give space that there is going to be kind of a feedback loop that promotes limitation to growth. So, real quickly, connected to this is another archetype called the tragedy of the commons. And essentially, this really fits in well with what I just mentioned is when we have industries that are focused on the use and abstraction of resources, that can have a significant impact on the community. So many of those resources are shared in those local communities. However, because of the growth mindset of these corporations, there almost creates this level of greediness and extraction to take those resources from the environment, or excuse me, from the community. And we've seen this time and time again, and again, frequent news stories are occurring. So, for example, in Atlanta City, or excuse me, near Atlanta in Georgia, we are seeing kind of this conflict between corporations and local police force and firefighters who are striving to build this training facility, and there's been protests against this because where that training facility is going to be located is currently part of public land that is for the community, and that is being taken away. And so, as we can see with that growth mindset, that abstraction of resources, that constant expansion, it can infringe on the environment and result in a tragedy of the commons, where eventually that extractive material creates an environment that is no longer fulfilling, no longer healthy, no longer reinforcing for the individuals. And that we see this again with the town I grew up in, as the environment began greatly manufactured and influenced by the dynamic companies that were there. We start to see impacts on the health of the community. People began to leave that community. There was less flourishing in that community, and that impacted the workforce of those areas. No, excuse me, of those industries, where those industries again left that area, and that had further impact on the community. So this kind of leads to another archetype that allows. So if we're all competing for the same kind of area or the same resources in the area, this can lead to a sense of escalation. So as the resources become more limited, we're going to see an increased competition and conflict of arising over those resources. Now, this creates almost a feedback loop where our goals for the organization now start to be questioned. We are running out of resources. We're increasing our competitiveness to gain those resources. We are realizing that our growth mindset is possibly flawed, and therefore another archetype may arise. And that is through eroding of our original goals of the organization. So, what this means is originally the organization had some sort of benchmark, some sort of productive or outcome measure that they're striving for. Now that the resources and the growth mindsets and the tragedy of the commons is all occurring, they have to lower the bar of the original goals in order to still seem somewhat productive. And so the goalpost has changed. And this can have a significant impact on organizations' communities' morale. This can also kind of foster a sense of distrust. And now, going back to all these ecological issues, what we see too is this accumulation of environmental disasters has really fostered this distrust to institutions and organizations. We have a distrust of the organizations that make a profit off these chemicals, and we even have a distrust growing of the governmental institutions that are seen to oversight those elements. So, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency in many of these communities has a sense of distrust. For again, this is something that I experienced growing up. We had federal and local agencies telling us that the environment was clean, that there was no possible risk, because yes, they did have testing of the PCBs, but it was at a level of risk that was not impactful for humans, so everything is okay. Now, granted, as the science has progressed, maybe at the time that level of danger was what the current science said, and as science has modified those dangers, so we need to take that with a caveat, a grain of salt. But essentially, there is this disconnect between what these institutions of power are telling people and almost the felt sense what the community is seeing, which erodes further trust. One could even say of using the narrative that identifying that toxic chemicals are present but still not the level of danger could also be seen as almost an eroding or lowering the goals or the bar when it comes to public safety. So with just examples from those archetypes, it makes us wonder if The industries that are producing these chemicals that possibly could impact environments, we wonder if give space and if those companies are possibly seeking out the wrong goals. And what if we can modify those goals and go rather from this striving for a growth mindset, this striving of extractive resource collecting mindset? Would it be possible for chemical corporations who produce these byproducts, industrial corporations who produce these byproducts, rather than having a growth and extractive mindset, would it be possible to facilitate a sustainability mindset? And with that, too, we almost need to really question what's commonly seen in the business and corporate sections of America is that language of success and winning. And so, if we're going to shift to a sustainability mindset, that's really going to possibly impact the language we use to understand what it means for a corporation to be successful and what does it mean for a corporation to be winning. And in addition, maybe we need to expand the systems thinking to realize that corporations aren't silo units in a community. Maybe in addition to expanding those mindsets, we need to incorporate, as Schirmer talks about, going from a me mindset to a we mindset. And so, possibly, what is striving or emerging in this time is really a public need and a want for corporations who engage in the production of chemical and hazardous materials to incorporate a we mindset and a community mindset and a long term mindset of thinking how can we best address these issues from a more collective framework. So, in applying more further, Schramer's work is now that we've kind of assessed some of the archetypes that may be arising with this possible issue, is what do we want to emerge from here? And just sitting with the thought that we could have corporations shift from a me versus we perspective and to move past a goal winning success framework into a more communal, sustainable framework, and just hearing those frameworks being expressed, what comes to mind? What felt sense arises? What is there? Does this feel like a possible reality? If not, what needs to change in order for this to feel like this is reasonable? And then sitting with that, what is emerging right now in this present moment to make those systemic changes occurring? Now, in addition to that, when using Theory U framework, Schramer talks a lot about how we have two dynamics playing at this time. We have the external dynamic of the organization and internal dynamics. And then, so possibly to promote further this growing and this changing mindset, we need to have corporations to foster that internal framework. How can we change the internal I to we, which will have a microcosmic effect of promoting an I to we shift on the corporate and organizational level? And so going forward, it's more how can we foster this? And I think continuing to really make clear that there's a lot of concerns about these contaminated products, and rather than getting into an us versus them mentality that's constantly fueled by narratives, it may be finding ways to foster some sort of community collaboration and really striving to find ways, okay, how can we work together to create a mindship changes of how we utilize and create these chemical products and how we can find a way to prevent contamination of our environments. And finally, with that, I think we really need to stress the need that environmental spaces are very important to us, and we respect us, and that we all want to live in communities that are environmentally safe. We want to have access to food that we can eat. We want to be able to partake in local river streams, fish, and even play in water without fear of chemicals poisoning our community, our friends, our family, and the wildlife around us. So, thank you.